Hi, welcome to our podcast. This episode is titled Shining a Light on UK Control Rooms. And today we're joined by Assistant Chief Officer for Humberside Police, Chris Philpott. Welcome. Chris is the National Police Chiefs Council lead for Contact Futures, the former head of contact management, the former head of force control and operations, and the current ACO, Director of Resources and Enabling Services. Chris brings rare, end-to-end real-world experience in frontline control room leadership, regional operational experience, national programme ownership, and strategic responsibility for resources and enabling services. Chris is ideally placed to speak about where control rooms are today and where they must go next. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Chris, let's kick things off with some context. The reality of control rooms today. You've led contact management and control room operations firsthand. How has the nature of demand changed in recent years?
I'd say probably the biggest change has been volume and complexity. Lots and lots of variation in what police control rooms are dealing with now. Large expectations from the public in terms of what they want from police control rooms and contact as well. But lots of things around mental health, vulnerability. It's a really complex environment for our people to be operating in.
Do you think the demand's increased through 999 101, or has it shifted between the two?
There's and even into digital channels. So as we've opened more channels, there's been more and more demand. So it is a real challenge, and understanding that demand has been a problem for police control rooms across the UK, and repeat demand as well, and demand for other agencies that are perhaps not policing demand, etc. 999 Police tends to be the first thing that somebody says when they've got a crisis. So, policing as a result of that ends up with a huge amount of demand that it needs to work out what to do with that demand to best service the most vulnerable people that are calling.
Absolutely. And obviously with 999, you've got to have a person answering the call. So sometimes when it's misused, then it's effectively that they should be rerouted elsewhere to social services, etc. It really puts a strain on the operators in the control room. Yeah,
absolutely. Certainly educating the public in terms of what is appropriate 999 use or not is something that has been a perennial problem for policing.
Yeah.
And we do campaigns in the summer period pretty much every single year around choosing the right channel. So yeah, that is a big problem for us. And also tech dialing 999 as well now. That's an interesting new development over the past few years.
Presumably mainly cars if they're in accidents, but
cars,
is there
phones, personal devices, personal assistants. We get all sorts of things.
Yeah, I'd imagine. Yeah, it's a different world now. What sort of challenges do you think are most misunderstood outside the control room?
The complexity of what the control room operators are dealing with. I think it's really simple to think that actually what we're doing in the control room is answering the phone, writing down what the person needs, and then dispatching a police officer to it. I think that's a really simplistic way of looking at it. And perhaps, 50, 60 years ago, that's maybe what it was like.
Yeah.
Certainly not like that now. Incredibly complex operating environment where our staff are expected to deal with really traumatic things day in, day out, and very large amounts of demand. It's an environment that's really closely controlled as well. So there's not an awful lot of autonomy for the staff. We need to keep people answering the calls. So that's difficult for them. I think just the complexity and volume of the environment is probably the most misunderstood thing in general.
Yeah, I think as well that with technology changes out in the real world, the expectation of the public has increased significantly because they're used to getting that level of service when they contact their local authority or when they contact their services for internet, etc. And if they're contacting the police, they expect that level of technology on the end. And obviously, there's instances where that's just not allowed, and instances where that's just not rolled out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a challenge. I mean, it's the way that policing is funded creates disparity in each force, and the demands at each force have got are very different, and where each chief constable wants to invest their money is different. So some forces will be better equipped at the control room end than others, and some forces will be better equipped in other areas to others. So it is a choice based on operating environment, etc. But there's big disparities in the way that each force is funded, especially from things like council tax precept, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
How many upper band households do you have in your area? That's going to create you more money than being in an area where there's lots of properties that are in lower bands. So those things all have an effect in terms of how much each individual force, I guess, can invest in the tech at the control room.
Yeah, and the drive from the police and crime commissioners, the chief constables down through the force, obviously that can change, especially with PCCs, where they can, and chief constables as well, where they can change every few years. The regional differences between sort of like a police force like Humberside, which is more of a regional sort of force, compared to maybe like a metropolitan style force. What are the sort of differences from a control perspective between those sort of different police forces?
The types of demand, I would suggest, as well as volume. The large forces get far more volume than we would get as a shire force, I guess. And the type of stuff we would get. So we get much more rural crime type calls for service, whereas there's probably higher elements of serious and organised violence and crime in your bigger metropolitan areas. The response times as well are more difficult. When you've got an amount of resource and a very large geographical area to cover, we try to get to emergencies in 15 minutes, right, from the point where we answer the call to somebody being there, 15 minutes. It's different doing that in a city than it is doing that in a large county with, towns and villages dotted across the area.
How does that work when it comes to the boundaries between, say, Humberside and other forces, where there's resources that may not be part of your police force, but they're closer to the scene of the incident? How do you interact with the forces in order to sort of maximise the response?
I guess it depends on the type of incident and the type of resource. For a general response, you'd go to your own more often than not.
Okay.
If something crosses county boundaries, then you're in contact with the control room from the next county over, and you're working what your resources look like. If it's a response to something that's quite specialist, we've got, for example, here the regional marine unit, right, which we may deploy into another county in the region who don't have that capability to aid with something like a missing person or something like that.
So do you have shared skill sets? Do you share resources with other forces? I know some forces might have like a shared firearms division or shared dogs team between other with neighbouring forces. Do you go that far, or are you not quite in that area?
We have shared resources in terms of specialist capability, marine being an example. MPAS, which is run West Yorkshire, for example, shared resource. Some of our back office functions are shared, not just with other police forces, but also with other blue light services. So here in Humberside, for example, we share our fleet management service, looking after our vehicles, and also our estate service, looking after all the buildings, with fire and rescue. So we collaborate across blue light, not just between police forces.
Yeah, and does the fire and rescue come under the same PCC in Humberside?
No, absolutely not.
Right.
No, they're under Fire Authority, PCC separate.
Okay. That's a really good sort of example of collaboration locally. Let's look at control rooms through a strategic lens. So from your ACO perspective, how do control rooms fit into the wider organisational resilience?
The control room is right at the forefront of everything we do operationally. It's where somebody in crisis first speaks to a member of the police service. Okay, so that's incredibly important. When we talk about trust and legitimacy and public confidence, if we don't answer the phone, that's gone already. In the same way that you won't trust your utility company if they don't pick up the phone. You need to do that. You need to do it quickly. So that's really, really important. Now, once you've done that, you need to prioritise your response appropriately. Okay, to make sure you get into the most vulnerable, not necessarily those that shout the loudest, but those that are the most vulnerable, those that are the most in need. We have a finite amount of resource in terms of the amount of police officers we've got to send to those kinds of jobs. So we need to make sure we send them to the right ones in the right order and as quickly as possible, and keep the member of the public updated. Which is a key issue, I think, for for police control rooms and policing. You know, we are so reactive to the volume of demand that's coming in, because we have to be, that actually we're probably not as proactive in terms of keeping people updated as the public would like. You know, and there's loads of work going on from an innovation perspective in that regard, in terms of proactive messaging, giving public access to a national portal where they can track the progress of a crime, they can message the person that's investigating it, they can receive messages about it. Because 20% of the contacts we get into control rooms is people wanting an update on something they've already spoken to us about.
Yeah, it'd be great if you could automate that, and I think that some forces obviously have managed to do that. But if they're coming on 909, obviously they've got to take as a call with an operator. The demand that police forces have, everyone can imagine the typical sort of urgent demand, but they often don't realise the amount of demand that comes in that's not necessarily as urgent, but they still need to be either dispatched or scheduled for a police officer to go to an incident or go to a member of the public to take a witness statement or whatever. How does the control room play a part in the less urgent priority responses?
Historically, it's been about triaging those things out, either redirecting to the right agency or educating as to why it's not necessarily a policing matter. And our control rooms across the country play a vital part in that. In terms of the types of things that we get and how we resolve them, that's certainly changing. Here in Humberside, with one of our other force colleagues in Thames Valley, Hampshire, we were the first forces to go live with an agentic AI capability on our websites. Mm-hmm. And that agent is answering between 75 and 80% of all queries from information that's held centrally by the College of Policing or in other guidance to answer the question without the need for a human to do it. So 75 to 80% of the demand that's coming in on the digital channels from a contact perspective is not requiring deployment or further action.
Yeah.
And that's, we now need to move into a space where, when it's coming into the control room itself, that's happening on different channels.
So that's I'm sorry.
And I'm really cautious about that, because we've all interacted with voice agents that have been terrible, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Phoning banks and all the rest of it. So we need to make sure that the service that we give, if and when we start doing that as policing, needs to be appropriate and robust enough to deal with the full breadth of society, because we are here for everybody, and we need to make sure that everybody gets the same service regardless.
Absolutely. You touched on there quite a modern technology there with agentic AI, and there's a lot of excitement in policing, in public safety in general. Obviously, in the wider world, agentic AI is quite becoming more the norm, and there's good agentic AI and not so good agentic AI. So do you feel that it sounds like maybe you do, that now is the time to be able to bring that into the 101 channels? I know some forces are starting to do that. Have you explored beyond just the digital channels, but actually the voice channels to trial anything, or have you deployed anything yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So nationally, there is a pilot that's been led by 2 or 3 forces to bring that voice triage into the centre, and not do it as individual forces, but actually do it in the centre with the supplier. Okay, so all 101 calls will get triaged by a voice agent before then coming out to forces, which should reduce demand for every force, rather than doing it individually and having that kind of lottery around whether a force can afford to do it, or the speed of rollout, or all those kinds of things. And that's part of the work that I do in my national portfolio. It's how do we build something once and use it 43 times across all forces, rather than a force doing something and then every force trying to do it and doing it a bit differently with different commercial arrangements and all those kinds of things. If we can bring it into the centre as a component and say, right, we're going to do this. This is the contractual terms. Everybody's on the same. This is the benefits. This is what it's going to give you. Build it once, and then roll it out many times, rather than 43.
So that's a fantastic segue into a conversation around the recent white paper that's obviously been released by the government around the reform of policing and the move towards the creation of a national police force and fewer regional forces, so the merging presumably of regional forces. That's quite recent. People are still getting their heads around that in the supplier sort of world. So as an insight into, because you're right in there in the middle of this in the conversation, how do you think that will change things?
I view it with an equal amount of excitement on what the future could be, especially with that national hat on and that portfolio. What value can I add to that agenda moving forward? What's the strategy that we have currently for moving forward dovetails really nicely into those reform ambitions. But I'm acutely aware, with my local leadership hat on, of the nervousness that the white paper brings to our operational colleagues. What does it mean for them? Does it mean, that somebody's going to one day be working in Grimsby and the next they're going to get posted to Richmond? If forces start merging together, those kinds of questions are natural questions for our people to ask. So I see it as a real leadership challenge for policing, but I also see it as a huge opportunity to affect a real step change in the way that we do things nationally. I can only really comment on my own portfolio when it comes to the finer details, I guess.
I've had quite a lot of experience of delivering command and control, computer-aided dispatch, radio dispatch and telephony systems in the UK, but also in Europe and beyond. And in Europe, there's lots of national police forces. So the UK is quite unusual in the sense of having so many regional forces. So in one sense, it feels like we're making that huge step change, and all the advantages that those national forces have, where they make one decision once and they roll it out across the nation, etc. And that's a real positive. But there is a downside to that as well, where competition sometimes doesn't get the look in that it should do, and you end up going down single routes. So how do you think that or do you know how that might be safeguarded in the future?
I know that conversations are being had. I don't think that anybody wants to see a kind of vendor lock-in kind of situation.
Absolutely.
Certainly in the contact futures space, the strategy for us is around one set of standards, common standards. So the onus on us to tell the supplier community, these are the standards by which we want to operate. One platform, and I don't necessarily mean one single platform, one integrated suite of capabilities that form a platform for policing, which is not going down a single route. We can't, from a risk perspective, lock ourselves into single vendors. That's not what we should be doing, and neither should we be locking competition out from the market either. But we should be very clear about what we're doing, and interoperability is going to be a very key part of that, so that it feels like it's one interoperable platform, especially if the outcome of the reform white paper, and it is a white paper at the moment, okay, so it is all theoretical. If the outcome is that we are going to create national capabilities that are going to have to interact with regional local forces, then we're going to have a common shared platform for that. And underpinning all that is delivering a single contact experience, one contact experience. Okay, so it should feel the same regardless of whether you're contacting the service in the southeast or the northwest. And that's the strategic ambition of that kind of contact futures portfolio that I'm leading on for the MPCC.
Absolutely. And I think some of the initiatives like police.ai, where there's, if I've understood it correctly, where there's a central direction over what AI applications or services are approved. There's some sort of rigor to go through to be able to get them endorsed and accredited, but then it's still down to the individual force and to make the decision on which AI services that they might use. And from a vendor supplier perspective, that's great, because it means to us that we can look at different AI solutions, create our own maybe, but work with partners, and not necessarily have to be exclusive with anyone, and design our solutions to be agnostic of the different AI solutions. And in other countries, they don't do that. So to me, if we replicate the police.ai approach into different areas, I think that'd be a really fantastic future sort of world for vendors to really compete in.
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads of areas within policing processes where that's absolutely applicable. But I also think there's areas where policing probably needs to think about doing it for itself. So areas where things like, for example, how we assess threat, harm, risk, vulnerability, we need to make sure that is consistent across everything, done in a way which is ethical, that we've met all those guardrails that are being set for us nationally, that the data is being used correctly. I think it's difficult if you've got situations where you've got 2 or 3 different types of tech doing that one task. So I think for really specialist things that are risk critical, there's an argument for saying, actually, should we be looking at ourselves as a service and developing that? Whereas there are other things within command and control platforms, records management systems, those kinds of things where actually, it could be vendor specific.
Yeah, or decided by the police force, and the vendors that provide something like a computer dispatch system just have to plug into your choice of AI for Thrive, for instance. So when it comes to doing that initial triage, to decide or to ensure and prompt the operator to make sure that you've gone through the right processes and covered everything off, and it's listening into the calls, so it prompts the operator if they mishear something or that maybe he didn't enter something incorrectly. But that could still be something that the computer dispatch systems or the contact management systems don't get the choice. They don't force it upon you. It's more that they need to plug into the choice that you've made.
Yeah, absolutely. Augmenting those component parts into our core systems is a big part of the future. We spend too much time right now looking at process and the technology being quite clunky, and data quality challenges, all those things, and we have to remember that quite a lot of the time the staff in our control room are new into policing, and they are having to remember so much stuff, not just about the subject matter of the call that they're taking, but also how to do X, Y, and Z on a call, right? And if they don't get it right, then the response might not be right, and worst case scenario, there's life at risk. So that's quite a big ask of somebody coming new into an organisation. So anything that we can do to take the burden of the administration elements away from somebody, to allow them to have really human-centric conversations with the person that's in need, that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely. I think that, we all know, at least I hope we do in the country, just how critical the skills and the well-being of those operators are, because they're in such unlike a typical call centre, although they're in a call centre, they may get under some sort of abuse, but they haven't got the same levels of stress and importance put them where they are effectively trying to make decisions to save lives. What's the importance of leadership in the control room and support of well-being in order to retain those skills? Is it a challenge in the control room?
Yeah, 100%. It's a challenge. Yeah. It is a very, very difficult environment to operate in. You don't know what you're going to get next. Okay, so not only is it difficult in terms of shift patterns and all that kind of stuff, but you don't know what you're going to get next. And you might get something that's really, really harrowing and distressing, right? That takes you, a long while. Okay, you might need a bit of time to decompress after that. You might need to speak to a supervisor. You might need further wellbeing support from a supporting service. All those things. The next call might be somebody complaining about a car obstructing their driveway. You've got to give the same level of service and empathy and response to both. Now that's a massive challenge for somebody, and the types of calls that our control room operators get, they are traumatic, and over and over and over again. They deal with far more individual calls, right, than any other area of policing, because they are at that front end. They might have, and repeatedly, and they can't choose. So your supervisor, your manager, can't ensure that you're not going to get exposed to something because it's had a difficult wellbeing impact on you. it's the luck of the draw in terms of what comes through at the moment. Now, with the advent of AI and voice triage and all those kinds of things, we can start thinking about, actually, do you know what, we've had an operator over here who's had a very, very difficult call that's been, high violence or whatever. We won't direct any more of those calls to that individual for X or Y. It starts to open up those kinds of opportunities for us that we don't have right now. But we have to, and I can't speak for all forces, obviously, but I can speak for Humberside. We offer psychological health screenings to all of our control room operators. Right, we treat them as if they are in one of those kind of specialist high harm roles, because they are being repeatedly exposed to things. And what makes them really good at identifying threat, harm, risk, and vulnerability is that they've experienced it. But then we are exposing them to it over and over again. So it's incredibly difficult. It's taken very, very, very seriously. Huge amounts of wellbeing support in there. Whenever any change is done, it's done with the staff, rather than it being a top-down decision. And how it affects their well-being is always at the core of the decision making. It absolutely has to be. Absolutely has to be.
And I think technology can play a huge part in improving that, but it doesn't take away from the knowledge and skills of the senior managers around the operators to be able to spot things. But where technology can prompt like well-being checks, can maybe route calls, or at least routes from call taker to dispatcher, depending on what that dispatcher's experienced most recently, or whether they've got a flag against them, etc., for a particular type of incident. I think that can improve things, but it only goes so far, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's unfortunately it's the nature of the job. It's what we deal with day in, day out.
Yeah.
But utilising the technology, I guess, to present things that are appropriate or not, or don't present things that aren't appropriate, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
To the right person. So right from day one, as a new operator sat there, you could get anything. Right, you'll have a buddy, you'll have somebody experienced with you, right? But you could get anything at all, right? Is that the right way of doing things? But at the moment, that's the way that our tech and our systems do things. So we might want to expose people to things that are slightly less harm to start with, and then help them on that journey, rather than day one getting something really, really critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an interesting space for us to start exploring as the technology evolves, definitely.
It really is. And I've sat with a number of operators over the years, and there's never really been an instance where I've gone into a control room and sat next to a call taker or dispatcher that I haven't left learning something new and having a increased understanding and appreciation for just what they do. And I get compared to yourself, I get such a sort of small snippet of that, but it's a very, very high stressful role. Looking ahead, so 2026 this year, 2027 and beyond, what are some of the biggest changes? Obviously, we've got the white paper, but also contact futures. What are some of the biggest changes that you think we'll see being introduced to control rooms in the UK?
There's an awful lot of noise and an inevitability of kind of AI augmentation for our people. Demand is increasing. Budgets aren't, right? In real terms, they're not. So we need to look to how do we deal with the demand that we're getting in a proper and ethical way, and make sure that our people are available for the most critical things that we get to have to deal with. So that augmentation of AI is something that's got to happen. I think the way that we deal with and think about our contact is changing, in that we are starting to think about it as an end-to-end journey, rather than it being a siloed, right, we do something in the control room, then we pass it over to somebody to either go or to investigate it, and then that's kind of, and it's just passed in that kind of process to right, how do we take this view this as one journey, and keep people informed all the way along the journey, and even into the wider justice system, not just in policing. If it's moving from us into the CPS for a decision, etc. And those discussions are being had with a wider justice community. But if we keep you informed and give you choice in terms of the channel that you want to contact us on, or even choice in the way that you want to report something, because not everybody wants to talk to us. We might have somebody who's a victim of domestic abuse, for example, who wants to report it but isn't ready to talk to somebody, right? So there's a question, right? So what does technology have a part to play in that, right? And that's quite an uncomfortable thing to think about. Could an AI agent take something as critical as that into our systems for us? Loads of ethical and moral questions, right? But they're the things that the service is challenging itself in terms of the questions that it's asking and exploring and discussing, either through ethics portfolios or through the AI portfolio or through the contact portfolio. These are questions that are being asked. So yeah, it's an interesting space.
It really is, and I think that there'll be there already is now, but an increasing instances where AI is prompting and highlighting good practice or another question to ask or suggestion to the operator. But then at what point, and I've worked in control rooms, delivering systems of control rooms that aren't police, and they're security services, so they're still sort of dealing with responding to incidents, but they're known incidents. So they're things where alarms go off and you have pretty much 90+% fully automated responses from control rooms of their staff to a scene of an incident. But it's a different type of model. It's not that you couldn't lift that and put it into policing, but you could imagine a world where there's much more automation and much more AI, where it actually does dispatch and get to that stage. Do you think we're a long way away from having no human involved in the process?
Yes. Yeah, I don't see certainly in the short medium term, and even then I'm struggling to think about it in the longer term, a world where we don't have humans doing the dispatch element or call handling for that matter. I think we can do an awful lot with technology, but we are a people. But we are a people service. That's what we do. We represent our communities. We are there for them. I just don't see a world where that's automated. I can see an argument for lots of other areas of the I'm going to call it business, the organisation being automated, but those critical operational areas, I don't. I can see technology assisting. I can see technology improving data quality. I can see it improving the quality of the service that the individual gives by providing real-term, quality assurance type feedback. I can see it helping our officers in real time outside, not just in the control room. Do I see no human? No. I
think the only places where I see there's a potential for that and it being accepted by the public and actually adding value would be sort of two scenarios. One being that where you could start the dispatch automatically and then for the human to make the decision to either tail it back or change the response, but the dispatch is already commenced. And this happens in ambulance. So in ambulance they do automatic dispatch in some trusts where an incident will come in, and as it's listening to the call they realise this is something that's really important, and they'll start dispatching 2 ambulances automatically to the incident, and then the operator will make a decision which one to turn off. And I think there's a value there. And then the other one would be something that's more of a routine. Maybe there's been an accident, an RTC, and it's about clearing up the accidents, and it's about sending resources there to do an investigation or whatever it may be. I know that's a little bit of a different scenario, but that could be fully automated potentially. Do you not see that coming in?
Not in the short to medium term. No. Okay. I can see recommendations being provided, but I think from a policing perspective, it's likely to always be the human that makes the final decision. The only time where I could see the potential for something like automated dispatch is if it was, for example, like a non-resourced response. So, for example, something where it's going to take us a while to get there, can we get a drone up? Can we get a drone there quicker?
Absolutely.
Right, those kinds of things, I could absolutely see it. But in terms of that actual operational person going, if it's an emergency, we know it's an emergency, and we dispatch it straight away. And it's dispatched before the call's finished. And if we need to dispatch more, we dispatch more. But equally, I think there's a part to play in responding in a different way and using technology for things like video response rather than necessarily sending a person.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very, very dependent on the type of situation. And I remain unconvinced by that, but maybe there's people out there braver than I.
No, I think that policing will probably be the last agency or the last I want to say mission critical, but critical control room to go that way, and it will never go fully that way. But I just wonder how long it'll be before there's some real value to be added in having some sort of automated response. What do you see the biggest challenges are facing control rooms over the next couple of years?
Demand, pace of change, speed at which technology is advancing, budget, legacy tech debt. All really critical things for us in terms of the operation. Resourcing remains a challenge in some areas more than others, depending on what the economic makeup of that environment is. Some forces really, really find it difficult to resource their control rooms. Others don't have so much of a retention issue. But they're the perennial things. And then, we've got the white paper, which, if that ends up being legislation, if that ends up being, we don't know what those changes look like. So I think there's challenges there in terms of how the system is going to shift, change, augment to meet those requirements moving forward. And that's going to have leadership challenges. It's going to have wellbeing challenges for the staff, process challenges, because, if you're merging with another organisation, public or private sector, it doesn't really matter. Your processes aren't the same, your systems aren't the same. All of those challenges will remain. So I think it's exciting potentially, but it's a big ask of people.
And we've seen similar things in the past. We've seen it attempted or tried with police before on a local level, where two forces maybe merge, and then either that works really well, and there's examples of that working well through the UK, England and Wales, and then there's instances where that hasn't worked so well. But we've seen it being forced out through ambulance. So the ambulance trust obviously used to have many, and they're now down to fewer. And the ambulance radio program delivering a common solution across all control rooms when it comes to radio dispatch and airwave integration. Do you see that level? Do you see that approach being the way that it'll be implemented, or is it just too soon to know?
It's too soon to know. The white paper's a couple of weeks old. A couple of weeks old, and they're not conversations that I'm involved in, so I can't really comment on them. My area is around that contact front end. We've been talking about what does enabling a potential future reform look like for quite a while now. So the strategy that we've been developing fits in really nicely. It was designed to try and bring more interoperability between forces, even if those forces aren't joined forces. How do we make the flow of information between forces easier and better? How do we ensure that even the forces that are small, right, or don't have large budgets, whichever way you want to look at it, because even the larger forces don't necessarily have lots of money. How do we ensure that we try and eradicate some of that disparity in what capabilities forces have through the strategies that we set locally within that contact portfolio? So that's the bit for me that's really, really important if we're talking about the wider kind of agenda when it comes to reform. In terms of how, what, and all the rest of it, that's far too early to say.
Where in policing does it sit where the decisions are made around standardising integrations between different systems, platforms. I'm trying to think about this contact journey that you talk about, and obviously it touches lots of different systems and platforms along the way. And left to the suppliers, they will maybe try to integrate and move that customer effectively along the journey but there's a role to play centrally to define whether it's mate, whether it's like a multi-agency instant transfer, which is obviously something that's been rolled out in recent years, but there's other standards based sort of approaches. Where in policing will those decisions come from
in the future? Too early to say from the white paper, I guess. It's now it will fall into individual portfolios, so does it sit in DDAT? It would be made there, right? And that would be an MPCC kind of led decision. Does it sit in the contact portfolio? We would make it there. Does it sit in the AI portfolio? There. What does the future of that look like as part of something national? That needs to work through the system. It's not something that, it is just a white paper at the moment. So more on that in the next few years, I guess.
Absolutely. It's a really exciting time, isn't it? So it's been a great discussion. And before we close things off, if you could change one thing tomorrow in the control room world, just snap your fingers and just change something, what would you difficult question to put you on the spot, but what would you change?
It's a really difficult question. Really difficult question. I would like to have a material impact on the well-being of the people that are doing the difficult job day in, day out. Okay, whether that's through technology, whether that's through welfare provision, whether that's through changing the way that we do things in terms of our processes, or our systems. Are we adding stress through our processes and systems to what is already a difficult job? If there's one thing that I would want to change tomorrow, it is reducing the stress and the trauma that is experienced by our control room operators across the country.
Thank you, Chris. That was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for watching, and join us next time.